Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
If you're an aspiring author, you'll be excited to hear that this week's sponsors are Curtis Brown Creative, the renowned writing school run by the major literary and talent agency.
Since launching in 2011, over 190 of their students have gone on to get major book deals, including critically acclaimed authors Bonnie Garmus, Julia Armfield, Stacey Thomas and Alex Hay.
CBC ran a variety of online writing courses designed to help you no matter what your current skill level is. If you're looking to get your novel off the ground, you might want to try the 6-week online Starting to Write Your Novel course, led by author and founder of CBC, Anna Davis. Or you can join a 6-week course focused on a specific genre. Available courses include historical fiction, science fiction, psychological thrillers, crime, romance, YA, and children's fiction.
All online students are given opportunity to get feedback from one of CBC's expert editors.
If you're ready to learn new writing skills with an online course, there is an exclusive discount for Always Take Notes listeners. Use the code ATN20 for £20 off the full price of Starting to Write Your Novel or any other 4, 5 or 6-week online course. Visit www.curtisbrowncreative.co.uk to find out more. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to James Daunt, Managing Director of Waterstones and CEO of Barnes & Noble.
We spoke to James about setting up his own independent bookstore in the 1990s, about being brought in to save Waterstones 2 decades later, and about taking on the top role at Barnes & Noble as well.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
James, welcome to Always Take Notes. Thank you so much for taking the time. We wanted to start off with the thorny question of the optimal angle of shelving in bookshops. We saw this came up in a piece the New York Times wrote about you, and that you had a week of dispute about whether it should be 3 degrees or 4 degrees. We wonder if you could unpack for our listeners precisely what that difference entails, but also maybe in a broader sense why that was something that was so significant for you.
I think it was probably sort of embellished somewhat, but I had a great friend called Miguel Sal, who was based in Italy. I think he was actually Argentinian by origin, sort of wonderful designer, and who did sort of all sorts of very elevated design work for people like Ducati showrooms and other sort of high-end Italian type things, but was also obsessed with bookshops. And we did a number of sort of two-handers, just explaining really around sort of the visual merchandising principles and how one should engage with bookselling to a school for booksellers, which exists in Italy. So one of the sort of nice perks of the jobs is to talk about and teach bookselling. And then when I started to really open up new shops at Waterstones in a serious way, we debated at considerable length sort of actually how do you best present books in a bookshop. You need an angle on the shelving just to allow light obviously to fall on the books, but also to stop them falling on your toes. And then it becomes sort of quite heated if you are passionate about such small things as to whether the angle should be consistent or whether it should increase as you go sort of down the shelving unit to present the lower shelves at a more acute or a wider angle so that they point up at you and so on. And in fact, I think at the end of the day, every bookseller should, really want to and be deliberate about how they design their bookshops. I've had the lucky advantage of both doing it in my own shops, but subsequently at Waterstones and now at Barnes & Noble. And therefore I can tell you empirically that most bookshops that have been opened at the moment have an angle of about 3 degrees, and that works very nicely.
You were victorious. In general, could you give us a sort of description of the platonic ideal of the bookshop, sort of visually, as you see it, beyond the bookshelves as well?
Every bookshop should, as far as able, be distinctive and have its own personality, and of course is adapting to the physical space that it occupies. And bookselling is notoriously tight margin business, and therefore we tend to occupy peculiar spaces because, frankly, they're cheaper. That the standard square box will have an H&M or a Zara in, or somebody who could pay the top whack, and we'll be in the peculiar one. And we tend to, when we're sort of taking shops, we find ourselves sort of competing with people like sort of shoe retailers, because they also can occupy strange places, but we really can. And therefore, each shop is not just about presenting books nicely and attractively, but also adapting itself to the physical architecture of the space, which in our case will tend to have lots of pillars in it and lots of compromises, because that gives us a lower rent. I also think, happily, it also allows us to create quite intimate spaces. And at the end of the day, that's probably the most important thing about a bookshop, is that it has to be warm and inviting. They are social spaces, but they're also quite intimate spaces. And how do you achieve that? And how do you achieve the balance between the different parts of the shop to allow a flow of people and different age groups? We cater, obviously, to everybody, for young and old and all in between. How do you give each of those groups of people their own spaces that work for them? A teenager wants a very different space to, the young 30-year-olds who are meeting. So a bookshop has to identify and adapt itself to each of its customer groups.
Could we roll back now in your own life and your career? So you read history at university, and then you worked in the US for JP Morgan. How did you end up doing that? And then why did you decide that you then wanted to take a very different direction?
To be honest, I was a fairly lackadaisical student. I mean, I loved what I was doing and reading, but I hadn't thought that I was ever going to leave university. So it was a somewhat rude shock at the end of 3 years to be turfed out, and also obviously needed to work. And in an overprivileged way that sort of Oxbridge does, there's a career service you can go to, and somebody says, there are these jobs and those jobs, and what are you thinking of? I wasn't thinking much at all, but there were banking jobs in New York, and giving one the chance to travel, and obviously they were then, as now, sort of ridiculously well paid. So unimaginatively, and for no better reason than it sort of sounded fun, I went to work for a bank. I didn't do it for very long. Whilst I liked the job, and it is hugely stimulating, it's also all about money, which is sort of not quite what I sort of felt I wanted to spend my life thinking about and talking about, and left them. Took me a little while, but in the end decided that if I wasn't going to be working in an office, then I had to do something I enjoyed, and the thing I enjoyed was reading. So I opened a bookshop.
Is it right as well that your wife was part of the decision to quit banking?
Yeah, she didn't approve of the banking and all that came with it at all, and thought it was incredibly boring and not really what I ought to be doing. Yes, I mean, we were then, obviously sort of barely left university, so student sort of boyfriend, girlfriend, but happily we're still together.
Could you tell us about the mechanics of opening the first Daunt books in 1990, how you actually went about that process, finding a location, and then with the financing? And we saw that you got some support from something called the Businesses Expansion Scheme that doesn't exist anymore. But just tell us how that went about right at the beginning.
Obviously, because I was young, I think I left my first job when I was 24 years old, and as I say, it took a couple of years. So 26 when I opened Daunt Books, the bookshop. I needed money. There was something called the Business Expansion Scheme, as you said, which gave a tax break. Effectively, you could deduct what you invested, I think, into a business expansion scheme from your taxes, and that incentive I very successfully sort of encouraged individuals to put money into entrepreneurial businesses. It certainly worked for my case. I wrote a very ordinary prospectus. I think I want to open up a bookshop, and there were plenty of portals in which people like me could say, I'm young and keen, and do you want to put some money into me? And a whole group of people did so, and that gave me the capital to open up a bookshop. Unfortunately, bookshops are quite expensive to open. You've got to buy an awful lot of books to put on the shelves, apart from anything else. And I was very lucky to find this beautiful shop in Marylebone High Street, and which had been an antiquarian bookshop. It was the first, indeed only, purpose-built bookshop in the country. And that gave me a wonderful place in which to to start.
And what was the Daunt Books sort of USP from the start? Was there a particular sort of decor, sort of mood that you wanted to evoke? How did you go about arranging the books that you'd bought? Could you kind of walk us through that whole sort of initial setup and the decisions you made there?
I felt that if I was going to have an independent bookshop, it ought to try and do something that was distinctive and different to then the sort of relatively sort of limited number of chains, but we had Waterstones and Dillons and a lot of people that no longer exist. And they were all arranged exactly the same as most bookshops are today, conventional subcategories, fiction, history, and so on. I, in fact, arrange Daunt Books and continue to arrange Daunt Books by country, which is how I read, and that puts novels, histories, anything into country sections that they're about, the novel where it's set rather than where the author comes from, the history where it's about, and so on. It mixes books up, I think, in a very interesting way. It's certainly, as I say, how I read, and therefore arranging a bookshop in that way seemed worth trying. And it is fun and it's distinctive, and it allows you to present books in a very different way. And happily, customers have enjoyed it and continue to enjoy it.
And how long did it take before it was a going concern, as it were, in terms of that you were making a profit, or that you were in a position where you could pay yourself? Was it relatively smooth sailing in the early years, or were there particular moments of challenge?
It was fairly disastrous. Initially, I opened in 1990, having sort of taken a lease at the top of the property market in 89. There was a nasty sort of retail recession, which sort of kicked off more or less as I opened my doors. Most of my neighbours closed on Marylebone High Street. For those who haven't been there, Marylebone High Street is a very shishy and prosperous shopping street now. Then, when I opened, it was also, but within 6 months, everything had closed just about. I think we and Boots and a newsagent were literally the only retailers that survived that period. And I always sort of felt gripped by a sense of panic whenever I had a queue in the shop in the early days, because it probably meant the bailiffs were in the shop, because otherwise I wasn't going to have a queue. So no, it was difficult to begin with.
What were some of the lessons you learned from that recession that you've kind of taken on through the rest of your career?
If you're going to get through tough times, hopefully you get a bit of luck, and I definitely had that, but probably it's mainly going to be about sweat and application, sheer hard work, and that's what got us through. Working all the hours that God gives, as you say, sort of not paying yourself anything and just toughing it out, and that sort of grit and determination is a lesson that's worth learning. It's not a pleasant lesson. As it happened, I was then to find myself at Waterstones in very difficult circumstances, and then Barnes and Noble at very difficult circumstances. And I think having sort of been through dark times and knowing that if you just concentrate and stick to the knitting and do it properly, you can come out the other end, was probably helpful.
You've talked a lot elsewhere about the importance of having good staff, particularly staff who've stayed with you for a long time. How did you go about recruiting people, and how did you get them to stay for years and in some cases decades?
I think you attract like-minded people, and that's no more complicated than interviewing properly and carefully and recruiting people who you like, and who you think you're going to want to work alongside, which obviously in a small bookshop is very much the case. But I think that principle applies however large the business is. And then you have to pay properly, have a very nice culture, a supportive and enjoyable culture. And if you've got those things, people will stay with you. And it, for sure, a bookshop is hugely dependent on the caliber and motivations and the spirit that individual booksellers and collectively booksellers bring to their shop.
And then how did you go about expanding from that first shop? How soon after the sort of recession years were you able to move into Hampstead, Holland Park, other kind of very affluent areas of London? Was that a deliberate decision as well to set up shop there?
The expansion was sort of more accidental than deliberate. Only as we began to sort of succeed, we could recruit more people. So the team at Marylebone High Street got larger. And then individuals within it wanted their own shop. If Marylebone High Street was sort of pretty much my shop, and if you wanted to do your own thing, then you needed to have your own, and so it was a sort of organic and fairly natural growth for us, and as much about allowing us to give opportunity to a team, which if you're just one shop is a bit more limited. And the early ones, we went up to Belsize Park and then Hampstead and Holland Park, as you say, and they were all very successful. And that's sort of carried on, not dramatically, but every few years, somebody says, "Oh, I'm moving out of London, and I think we should have a shop in X or Y." And so we've gone outside London as well, which is just gives more opportunity, and it allows people to move around and frankly ambitions to be met.
And during that time that you were building yourself up as an independent bookseller, what was your perception of the big corporate chains? And then moving from that, how did you end up taking the Waterstones job?
I think my perception was sort of one of sort of broad indifference. They were there. I sort of a bit like I feel about Amazon. It's there. It sells lots and lots of books. It does something sort of rather different to what I do. I didn't sort of particularly mind them, but equally, I felt they were very, very different to anything that I could identify with or relate to. Then that became sort of slightly more complicated when they got into trouble, and Borders went bankrupt, Dillons and Ottakers and things all sort of merged into Waterstones. And then sort of by 2009-ish, one only had Waterstones there. There was a few independents, Foyles, Blackwells and so on, but really the trade depended on Waterstones, and Waterstones was a very, very sick animal by then, less of a attractive bookseller, but also that was what the physical bookselling trade was sort of rooted on, because they had so many shops everywhere and there was nobody else. And then I became very, very much more interested in them, because I felt that their survival was actually essential for my own survival, because I needed warehouses and publishers and people focused on the physical book trade, because I lived off the crumbs of that infrastructure. And if that infrastructure was all based on Waterstones, I needed to be interested in what was going on at Waterstones.
So when you were approached for the job, it was a case of it immediately appealing as something that you wanted to do to help fix a sick animal, as you put it? Or was there ever a moment where you thought this was a very sort of daunting, pardon the pun, challenge?
I was sort of arrogant enough to believe that the principles of good bookselling are fairly universal. As I said, I did quite a lot of teaching of bookselling. Miguel Sal and the Italian Booksellers School was something that predated my involvement with Waterstones. So I sort of knew about bookselling. I was very interested in bookselling, and I also thought that if you applied that to Waterstones, there was absolutely no need for them to go bust. It was ridiculous. They had all these wonderful shops up and down the land. And also it would just be really sad not to have bookshops in many towns where, clearly it was going to be highly unlikely that anyone would ever put a big bookshop into Middlesbrough or Grimsby or wherever it might be up and down the land. Tunbridge Wells was going to be fine, but not those kind of places. So I think I sort of went into it sort of with a sort of fair determination to wrench them round, knowing also that it was going to be quite difficult.
And in terms of the factors that had imperiled Waterstones and had killed these other chains, to what extent was it Amazon? To what extent was it the ebook? Could you unpack, looking back a decade or so, what was the perfect storm that had made things so difficult?
I think what had happened was certainly Amazon, which was hugely effective and just gobbling up market share with every passing year. The ebooks really hadn't at that point taken off. They were a very minor thing in 2010. They were launched, but it was only the earliest version of Kindle, and I think people were sort of wringing their hands and saying, "Oh my goodness, maybe this could become as much as sort of 5 or 6% of the market." So there was no idea that it was going to explode in the way that it did. But nonetheless, Amazon itself had undermined or had denied these chains the ability to prosper whilst being as bad and inefficient and frankly useless as they were. And once it became sort of really difficult for them. They had no efficient model, and bookselling is notoriously unprofitable. So there was no fat there to keep and sustain them, and they went one by one. Each time one of them went bust, the survivors could sort of feel better about themselves and slightly more profitable as they sort of cannibalized what was going on. But when there was nobody else, Waterstones was in big trouble and was just sort of simply going bust.
And so when you came into Waterstones, what was your first sort of port of call? Was it this sort of decentralization that you've mentioned, making each shop its own sort of individual entity, but within the broader group?
Yes, it was simply to say, articulate that if we ran each shop, if the individual booksellers and teams within each shop really addressed themselves to their bookshop and tried to turn them into a good bookshop, they would have much higher sales. And I knew just from going around the shops that the booksellers in the shops knew that as well. They just had structures around them which prevented them from running sensible shops. So it really was no more complicated than articulating that, but then also going to the publishers and explaining that we were no longer going to be fulfilling all of the deals that were then in place to effectively sell the space in shops, and that had to end. And at the end of the day, we controlled our own shops, and therefore it happened. Happily, pretty quickly, sales started turning around, and in particular, we got rid of all of the structures which were in place to impose uniformity on the bookshops, and that was an awful lot of people and cost. And so the head office dramatically shrank and all the costs attached to that. And that gave us a bit of breathing room and allowed us to, frankly, survive what then became a rather terrible storm when Kindle and Kindle Paperwhite really took off. But we'd just done it in time, and we managed to get through it.
We wanted to come back to Kindle and also to this habit of selling space that you got rid of. But a question from me, just reversing slightly, was that at the time that you came in, Waterstones was owned by this wealthy Russian, Alexander Mamut. There's obviously been a lot of discussion since what happened in Ukraine of the role of wealthy Russians getting involved in British sporting and cultural properties. We had a look; he's not on the sanctions list, as far as we can tell. But what's your thoughts about what that was like at the time, and then with the perspective of zooming on 13 years or so, and everything that's happened since then?
Well, I think Alexander Mamut is a sort of entrepreneur. He wasn't in the oligarch sense of being one of the people who sort of got huge natural resources or sort of that we sort of typically think of as these rich Russians. But he was very Anglophile and very literary and very interested in bookshops and publishing. So for him, I think it was clearly a business decision. He felt that it was ridiculous that no bookshops could survive in the United Kingdom, and as effectively the bankruptcy of Waterstones seemed to suggest. And at the same time, he had a sort of a great empathy for bookshops and bookselling. So he was an ideal owner. I think he probably perceived the money involved as being relatively modest. It's very, very helpful if you're trying to turn around a business to have a single owner who shares the philosophy behind it. And he was brave and put the money in there, which otherwise there was no way that, for example, private equity or somebody was going to at that stage. So I think it was highly fortuitous. Do I think it's sort of right and proper that individual entrepreneurs should take these sort of very risky bets where no one else would? Yes, if it saves jobs and particularly if it allows bookshops to survive. We were extremely lucky.
Could we return to then that point about co-op fees? Could you explain for any listeners who don't know what that is, what that involves, and why it had such a sort of stultifying effect on what you could do in the shops?
Sort of co-op and promo fees are very much an established part of general retail. When you walk into a supermarket and all the Kellogg's cornflakes are occupying a certain amount of space, that will be because Kellogg's are paying for them to be there, and the Head and Shoulders shampoo, likewise Procter & Gamble, whoever it is who make that, will be paying some money for it to be there. And bookshops worked exactly the same. They're just another branch of retail run the same as most other retailers. And that was predicated on selling the space. Publishers pay to have John Grisham on the bestseller list at number 3 and on the front table in every single store. Those sort of things, like selling your bestseller spaces, become self-fulfilling. So it's sort of kind of not cheating anyone. It still goes on. W.H. Smith operates on that basis. The supermarkets, when you walk in and find their books, they operate on that basis. Over here in the United States, it was how Barnes & Noble was doing it at the point I arrived, and other book retailers do. You don't find books racked up in airports, for example, because the individual shop manager thinks it's a great book. They're there because the publishers think they're going to sell, and they are the best sellers, and they're paying for the books to be there. So it's a very well-established retail model. The trouble for booksellers is that we have so many books being published all the time, and across the country, very disparate types of customer bases with individual interests. And of course, the booksellers themselves having their own interests. And a bookseller who's interested in a book will sell many more of it than if it's just something that's on a list. So we needed to get rid of it to bring proper sort of curation into our stores, proper engagement from the booksellers. It also happens with books to be extraordinarily inefficient, because there's such a tidal wave of constant publishing that's going on that if you pile up these publisher-dictated books, they're probably going to have it wrong in most places most of the time. And indeed, that was the case. So the way the book trade works is all the books you haven't sold, you send back what we call returns. And returns at a standard bookshop chain, Waterstones, before I joined, Barnes & Noble before I joined, would run at about 25% of sales. That's probably more like 75% of new books that come in, get piled up and sent back. So it's a huge amount of labor involved in that. It is in consequence of which actually most of your shop is all the books being piled up that your customers don't want to buy rather than the ones they do. And actually, if you stop all of that and you just let the booksellers put whichever books they want on the tables, reorder whatever they want to, all of those returns disappear, all the labor attached with it, all the costs. I mean, if you just think about the sheer freight costs, transport costs in and out, and you sell many more books. So although you've given up an awful lot of money, because you no longer get those co-op fees, and it was 27 million, I think, a year when I joined at Waterstones, and about 120, 30 million a year at Barnes & Noble. So big amounts of money, actually more money than the business as a whole made. You give up that, but suddenly your costs drop, you sell much more. And if you're running good bookshops, you end up making more money.
What was that discussion with the publishers like when you turned around to them and said that this, as you say, very established practice was not going to be happening anymore? We read that it was months of negotiation.
Well, it wasn't so much negotiation as that we obviously have where we operate within a book industry, and the publishers are sort of key partners to us. So you can't unilaterally do things because everything has to adjust. And it wasn't so much negotiation. It was like, how do we adjust our way out of this? Because you printed books, for example, on the basis of how we're taking them in. And if we're going to transition out of this, how are we going to do that with causing as least pain throughout, to authors, to you, to the whole sort of infrastructure that's there? And I think there was a certain amount of sort of hand-wringing. I think every publisher would have liked us to stop doing it with every other publisher but them, and that they would have all agreed would have been the ideal outcome. But at the end of the day, I was sort of like to them, which is like, has anybody got a better idea? And if it all works, we're going to sell an awful lot more books. And if it doesn't work, we're not going to be any worse off, because we're just going bust, and we're going bust anyway. So I think there wasn't much resistance. There was just a lot of concern.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pitches. Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes.
In terms of Waterstones' own role as a tastemaker, particularly its book of the month, how does that work? Who is the sort of panel of experts who's choosing that? And do you get lobbied for it from publishers?
We certainly get lobbied. We do, but the lobbying is, here's an advance copy, please read it. We think it's wonderful. Obviously, every editor in the land thinks their book is the best. Every parent thinks their child is the most beautiful. So we have the books come in, we spend our life reading them, and we try and make good choices. A lot of advanced copies go out into the shops. Over time, one learns who's got really good taste, and we've got a lot of very experienced booksellers who read very eclectically. I think we generally make pretty good choices. There's never so much as £1 attached to those choices. It is simply, we think we can sell a lot of the book. We think customers will enjoy it. We think there's a coherence in how we're choosing books. And in fact, we're not doing anything different to what used to happen with the huge popularity when I was first around of the book clubs, Richard and Judy and all of those things. They were just choosing good books. Those have dropped away in their popularity. They haven't disappeared, but they've dropped in popularity. And I think our own choices, which act in the same way, which is just to put a spotlight on books and say, these are really good. And if you're doing it consistently, then your customers learn to trust those choices, and it becomes a self-fulfilling thing. And boy, we've made some wonderful choices all the time, actually.
I was interested to read as well that you also sometimes provide feedback to the publishers. And the example that I saw was changing the colour of the serpent on the Essex Serpent to have a different colour during the winter. Could you explain both that particular case and then more broadly how some of that providing feedback works?
Well, covers matter hugely. Lots and lots of readers do judge a book by its cover. And a lot of our job is around creating as attractively presented bookshops as we can, which is to attractively present books, which is a lot easier if the book itself is beautiful. Publishers invest enormously, and actually in the UK, I think particularly effectively in the physical attributes of their books, and that's now become spray edges and foil effects and goodness knows what else, as well as just the cover itself. In the case of the Essex Serpent, I think that might have actually come from the publisher rather than from us, but it was a book that we absolutely loved. Sarah Perry, if anyone hasn't read it, read it. It's a gloriously inventive and tremendously good novel. And they published it with a very sort of summery look. And then in the winter, they turned it blue. And it just gave it a different look. And with the seasons, you do naturally change what your bookshop looks like. We flow. If you walk into our shops now, it's May, we're getting really into the swing of summer. It'll have a very summery feel about it. We're all thinking about summer holidays and trying to sell you as big a pile of books for you to read then as we can. By the time you come into winter, you start moving more slightly darker. And that was a very clever publisher who was just going with that flow.
We've obviously talked a lot about the importance of human curation and the human side of book selling, but how do your companies use data to inform what you're doing in the shops?
Almost not at all. We used to have immense amounts of data, and I hope none of my board, because I unfortunately report now to a board, can listen to your podcast, because I think I pretend I look at data, but I don't. All of the things that existed, things like footfall counters and the like, have gone. The one thing that we do is we run loyalty programs, and we try to understand who particular customers are from what they're buying, but not in too crude a way. We don't say, well, you read fiction, therefore we're going to recommend fiction to you, but we try and identify what are the types of books that if you buy, it's likely that you're this sort of a reader, and then we send you emails about those sort of books. If you've read the Essex Serpent, we kind of know what sort of a reader you are, and then we will put in front of you sort of good literary novels with strong plot lines and the like. If you're reading Colleen Hoover, we'll send you something very, very different, and stimulated the history and so on. So we do use data in that sense, but I think that's really just to bring what comes naturally and intuitively on the shop floor, what every bookseller is doing every minute of the time that they're serving customers, to email and online curation. So it's sort of data, but it's really about just interpreting the books that people are buying, and therefore using that to recommend other good books to them.
We touched on ebooks earlier, but could we return to this moment you mentioned when Kindle really got a critical mass and Kindle Paperwhite and so forth? Just explain maybe for people who don't know as much about what was going on at that particular moment. And then from that, how have things changed since, and how did you respond to what was going on?
Amazon brought out the Kindle Paperwhite in 2012-13, and it was embraced with huge enthusiasm, and newspapers were full of it, TV reporting full of it, and every other article it seemed to be sort of about the death of the book, and there was a sort of sense that there was an inevitable transition that was going on from physical books and paper to the ebook, and indeed, of course, that was evident in music, where vinyl had disappeared, CD was being disappearing to streaming services and Apple Music and all the rest. So it seemed sort of intuitive and natural that the way the physical media in music and indeed in film was transitioning, that book was also going that way. And it was dramatic success within the sales, big market share shifts onto E. And it was all pretty scary, if truth be told. At Waterstones, we were very early on in the turnaround, so it started at a difficult point of losing money and heading for bankruptcy, and then this sort of tidal wave of transition to E came along. My response to that was that, one, I never for one second believed it. I never for one second thought that more than a relatively small minority of people would actually want to read ebooks as their main way of reading, because the pleasures of a physical book are so obvious. But we did need to sort of engage with it, and the way with which we did so was actually to start selling Kindles, and that caused a certain amount of horror, I think, in people who wanted Waterstones to survive and felt we were simply, hastening our own demise. But what I wanted to do was say to people who were interested in Kindle, who were embraced the hype of it, was like, still come into our bookshops. Bookshops are wonderful places to find books and discover books. Bring your Kindle in, buy your Kindle here. By all means, sort of browse our books and then download the ebook, but come into our shops. And the bet was that if they were doing that, actually pretty soon they'd get tired of the Kindle. It would end up in a bottom drawer and not be opened and brought out again, and we'd be selling them books. And that indeed was pretty much how it went.
I'm afraid that's the fate that my Kindle met as well. It's the rule of the show that we always talk about money. You mentioned the importance of paying your staff good wages in terms of retention. There was at one point a petition from employees about pay. How much are your booksellers paid now, maybe in London versus elsewhere, and how have you managed to sort of address that complaint?
I think that the debate, and it's a very difficult one, is assuming that the amount of money that you have for pay is a fixed amount. So it's then the debate is then, how do you allocate that amount, and how much do you use that money to raise your base, your entry level pay, and how much should you be investing or giving and rewarding in the levels that we have above the entry level, i.e. how much do you give to the career booksellers, the people who are working in it, against the people who have just started or are working temporary through part-time, or over, for example, at Christmas we hire lots of part-time people. So the complaint and indeed the petition is for that we should be doing more at the entry level. And I've always answered that I completely agree with that, but I have to be able to look the people in the eye who work for me for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and more, and say, I'm paying you enough, because in order to pay more at the entry, I have to take away money from people who are building careers with me. And the answer is, I don't think we pay them enough, and that our primary obligation as an employer is to put more money into those promotional ladders, because frankly, it's booksellers, experienced booksellers, people who are building their careers in bookselling, upon whom the quality and excellence of the bookshop depends. So that's the debate that we've been locked in. I think that as a business, as we do better, then we should definitely be investing in our people. And it's the success with which we do that which will determine the success of the business as a whole. And again, I'm now started that journey at Barnes & Noble, where, as at Waterstones, you inherit a business which is dominated by people on the single starting wage, dominated by part-time workers, very, very few people who are staying in the business, almost no promotional structures. You just have a manager, assistant manager, and that's about it. But then put in all of the layers which allow people to stay and build careers and do so working full time. If you can have a full-time bookseller, you can learn obviously much quicker and more effectively than if you're only working a small number of days a week. So that's what I feel that that's been key to turning around Waterstones, and is now key to turning around Barnes & Noble. It's putting in a structure which allows you to retain booksellers.
And then how did this move from Waterstones to Barnes & Noble come about? And what were your thoughts about taking that or making that move when it first became apparent that you could?
Well, sort of oddly enough, it was the same dynamic going on, which was we were doing very well at Waterstones. We'd turned the business around and sales going up and opening more shops and generally doing really well. But then, and having no regard, frankly, to the United States. And then sort of slowly it dawning upon us that Barnes & Noble was the same as Waterstones had been. It's the sole surviving large major physical book retailer in the United States, and it was in big trouble. And then within our world, we have these international publishers who dominate it. They are owned mainly by Europeans. Rupert Murdoch owns HarperCollins, but otherwise it's Lagardère and Bertelsmann who own Penguin Random House, and Macmillan is also a German-owned firm. But they're all headquartered in New York, and the US book market is identical pretty much to the UK one. Same books published, same authors, same bestsellers. And therefore, actually, it is the US market which sort of dominates the Anglo-Saxon publishing world. And then this realization that if the physical bookshop failed in the United States, it's probable that the whole structure of the trade would adjust without a physical bookselling part to it. And whatever happened in the United States was probably inevitably going to come to the UK. And if we wanted to keep physical bookshops at the forefront of publishing on both sides of the Atlantic, we needed a strong Barnes & Noble. And that led to when Barnes & Noble sort of finally sort of really hit the skids, taking over, buying it and taking over here.
You mentioned some of the similarities, but I wondered if there were any particular or notable differences between American bookselling and corporate culture there and in the UK.
I mean, it's a big old country. the shops, the bookshops are very large, but no, I think Barnes & Noble was running itself very much like Waterstones was running itself, very centralized, very corporatized, based on co-op and promo, and driving this sort of notion that you needed consistency in your stores and investing huge amounts of effort to have every store be the same. Which is, after all, how most retailers work. You expect if you walk into Zara to get consistency. You don't want the Wild West going on. Whereas with bookshops, you really do. So it was just bringing that same principle there. Shops are bigger, but they so are the markets that they address. The books, as I say, are the same. The principles are definitely the same. And to be honest, I haven't found much really that's different between the two. There are some sort of edges around the culture and that are different, but I don't think the moves that we're making, and it is really about changing culture, I don't think those are any different at all. And I don't think the tribe that is the book-selling tribe is any different over here to, I speak from New York now, any different over here to the United Kingdom.
You mentioned earlier that you have a board to report to now, which you used not to. What has that transition from being your own master to working within a larger corporate structure been like?
Surprisingly unchanged. I think we know what we're doing. We stick to the core principles of how do you encourage better book selling in your shops, not get too overexcited about failure, because if you allow autonomy and increasing amounts of autonomy to bookshops, some will get very much better, but also some will get very much worse. So it is that tolerating the divergence of execution. To be honest, if you're reporting to a active and attentive board who are primarily really want to know whether you're making more money rather than less money, and if you are prospering, then they're pretty happy and supportive. And in fact, this board was very, very supportive and took some big risks when we were hit by COVID. I took over in September 2019, and sort of rather like Paperwhite and Kindle coming and knocking me sideways when I got to Waterstones, COVID came along and knocked me sideways when I got to Barnes and Noble. But the owners supported when we were forced to close all the shops, keeping everybody, all the full-time booksellers and experienced booksellers employed in the shops. We kept the lights on and we got to work in our shuttered shops, which in retrospect was an obvious thing to do, but at the time was quite brave because nobody knew when it was going to end. And it was obviously very expensive to keep on paying people when every other store was shuttered and people were furloughed.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so I wanted to ask, A, what it is that you like reading yourself, and B, just how much stuff you're reading every year.
I read reasonably eclectically. I always read a lot of fiction because, frankly, that pays the bills, and identifying really good and exciting fiction is important. But I also read always some form of nonfiction, generally something serious. And if there are great reviews that catch my eye, I always read those. And if editors that I respect or agents, suggest a particular book, I'll always try and read it. I've just finished, or I'm about 10 pages away from finishing a fantastic book which hasn't come out in the UK, I think, yet, called Monsters by Claire Dederer, which is essays. Well, it's an examination of why sort of so much creative genius is attached to the most despicable people, and to what degree do their actions and personalities stain or inform our own viewing of the art that they create, be it Picasso's paintings or in the movies, or indeed so many writers who are smirched. But underneath it also is a brilliant and very, very, very funny examination of our own motivations, and it's a powerful feminist book as well. So I read those kind of books, and then I read wonderful fiction.
I want to ask your view on some of the broader economics of the publishing industry. So we talk to a lot of writers on the podcast, and as Rachel alluded to, we always ask about money and how they've made it work as writers, and it's often very challenging. And what are your views on the fraction of the purchase price, both at Waterstones or more generally in the book trade, that then works its way back to authors themselves?
It's sort of, again, I suppose it's a bit the same in acting and the movies and the less. If you're a successful author and you have a bestseller, you really, really get very, very rich, and stupendous fortunes are made by the most successful authors. Equally, if you're mid-list or selling modestly, that it's difficult to earn a living. If in some forms of really important and creative writing, poetry, for example, next to impossible to earn a decent living. I think that's something that, as booksellers, we're able to sort of slightly step back and say, well, this is for publishers and authors to decide between them, with agents very much in the mix. because we sell the book for the price that the publisher sets. We don't set it. We're not like in most retail trades where the retailer is sort of driving the whole place. We're very much on receive. We've always been, the quite far down the chain, as indeed we are in status. I mean, it's a much higher status to be a publisher or an agent than it is to be a bookseller, precisely because we're not involved in that. Do I think there are difficulties around it? Surely there are. I was listening to an editor giving his retirement speech not long ago, saying that he'd come full circle. I mean, really esteemed editor, saying that he was paying at the end of his career the same advances that he was paying at the start of his career, 40 years. That's not right. At the same time, of course, as publishers have prospered hugely. When I started bookselling, you'd go to meet a publisher and you'd go down, to the rather dingy parts of London. You go to the far end of Fulham, you go over to Clapham. Nowadays, if you want to go and meet those same publishers, you go to one marble lined palace on the Thames or another marble palace on the Thames. The publishers have done quite well in this world.
Well, on that sort of cheering note, thank you very much for your time, James, and wishing you all the best with all of your ventures going forward.
Thank you very much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with James Daunt. He's not on social media personally, but you can find Daunt Books, Waterstones and Barnes & Noble on all sorts of social media platforms. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your impression of the interview with James?
I thought it was excellent to have such a distinguished bookseller and executive on the show. So obviously really enjoyed hearing about his approach at Daunt and then Waterstones and Barnes & Noble and how it basically all boils down to giving people responsibility and trusting in them to understand their local market. And I also really enjoyed the insight that and it sounds like an obvious one in hindsight, that bookselling is an interconnected ecosystem. If independents are struggling, then the bigger chains will struggle. And if American chains are struggling, then British ones will as well. So I thought that was fascinating. How about you?
Yeah, very similar kind of. I thought it was fascinating, and we'd never had a bookseller on the podcast before, so I suppose we've set the bar quite high with that. The thing that I found particularly interesting was, that kind of interconnected note. And I think this was when we asked him about taking the Barnes & Noble job, that he felt there was actually a moment where bricks and mortar, like physical bookshops, could just cease to exist as a thing, that it could have entirely gone online. And obviously, I don't think that would have been a good thing in any form. I also thought it was interesting how he said he just doesn't use any data, that it's all done on kind of intuition and those kind of things. But yeah, clearly an example of the benefit of pushing responsibility as far down the kind of corporate hierarchy as you can. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what has your cultural diet been this week?
Well, recently I did the big piece on Barbie and Oppenheimer, which came out and very excitingly got a flash on the cover of The Economist. So, pursuing my pop culture agenda. I've also written a piece on the growth of rosé wine for our food column. And I'm working on a couple of other book reviews and similar things, hopefully about Hollywood and the strikes as well. In terms of cultural diet, what have I been reading? I've been reading a book club book called The Happiest Man in the World, which is about an Auschwitz survivor. I haven't watched that much TV recently. I have been watching And Just Like That, because that's my guilty pleasure, which is the Sex the City spin-off. I
heard that And Just Like That had recovered from its mediocre first season and was now back in the groove.
I'm not sure I'd go as far as back in the groove, but it's definitely a step forward, I would say. Anyway, what have you been watching and reading?
Well, I read your Barbie and Oppenheimer piece, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was interesting, that line that there had been like previous attempts to make films about sort of nuclear history in the 40s and 50s, and they hadn't really worked. So in terms of reading, I've been reading the letters of Ella Meyer, this Swiss travel writer who I'm writing about my new book, which is fascinating, not least because she seems to kind of know everyone in Europe in the 30s, from Somerset Maugham to Winston Churchill, but also just the kind of sheer complexities of communicating across long distances. So lots of like working out who and via who she'll send her letters. And then in terms of TV and film, I have seen both Barbie and Oppenheimer.
Which one did you do first?
I did Barbie first. I was staying in Wales, looking after a friend's dog, and when they came back, they had organised an outing to Barbie, which I went to, which was notable in the Abergavenny cinema, that there was a large group of women who'd all come like in character in pink, which I was impressed by.
When I went to the press screening, men and women were in pink, and it took
Really?
took 45 minutes to get into the cinema. It was packed.
You did mention that the Barbie press screening was significantly better attended than the Oppenheimer one.
Yes, although I think potentially that might be A, because the Oppenheimer one was at 9 a.m, and B, I think they had multiple Oppenheimer screenings versus potentially one Barbie, but I'm not sure. So I'm trying not to read too much into the press screening dynamics.
This is a spoiler alert, but I particularly enjoyed the joke right at the end of Barbie, which I didn't see coming, but I thought was quite punchy for anyone who's seen that. And then I saw Oppenheimer on an IMAX print in Leicester Square, which was kind of amazing actually. Like, glad to have seen it on a big screen and everything like that. And then on TV, I have been watching another French series called Les Combattants, which is called Women of War on Netflix, and it's about 4 women at the beginning of the First World War, and it's actually better than I thought it would be. So I would recommend that. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Aiken.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter/X. Should we be calling it X now? I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
At Take Notes Always. On Instagram at Always Take Notes. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.